Your 2022 book on 12th century English is called A New Literary History of the Long 12th Century. Why is it called the Long 12th Century?
So I think there's probably two answers to this. One is practical and the other is theoretical. So the practical one is Cambridge told me to call it that. Um, in that I think that they wanted, I'll tell you what I wanted to call the book in a second, but I think that they wanted both the main title and the subtitle to describe the contents of the book. So the main title now is A New Literary History of the Long 12th Century, and then the subtitle is Language and Literature Between Old and Middle English. Whereas I think I was content for the main title to be quite elusive and the subtitle to do the work. So the original main title was going to be An Unknown Tongue, and that was really the working title throughout the project. And it comes from the passage that I begin the book with, which is what happened when the Norman guards first heard English at the coronation of William the Conqueror. And William of Poitiers says that they heard an unknown tongue, and hearing an unknown tongue prompts them to burn down Westminster Abbey. So it's this idea that English is strange and threatening. And so it was a kind of double use of that quotation in that uh, English was an unknown tongue to the Norman guards, and this book is very much about what happens when you have the Normans arriving in England to the use of English. But it's also arguably, I think, the unknown tongue of English literary history, that the 12th century is probably the least worked on period um, in English literary history, really, as a whole. So that's the practical reason that ended up being the title of the book. The more theoretical one, I suppose, is that periodization of any kind is to a certain extent arbitrary. So it's not like the 19th century really denotes any kind of significant period. 1800 to 1900 doesn't necessarily imply that significant things happened in that 100-year period. So the long 12th century is really a label of convenience. In that I wanted to be able to talk about the period 1042 to 1215, more or less. So 1042, because that's when Edward the Confessor becomes king, and already has quite a French retinue at court. So it's a kind of pre-Norman conquest moment of French influence. And then 1215, because that's the date of the Fourth Lateran Council, and which has always been held as a very significant moment for the use of vernacular languages, because of mandating confession and mandating certain levels of explanation of religious principles to the laity, which would happen in vernaculars and in England in English. So I think it's a label of convenience for 1042 to 1215, and it's modeled on things like the long 18th century, which some of my colleagues who work on later periods would be comfortable with as a label.
hmm So it's very complicated is what I'm getting.
Yeah, I mean, you have to periodize somehow because you can't write about the entirety of human history in one book, and all periodization is to some extent arbitrary, I think. I said,
Mhm.
don't think it would materially affect the book if I wrote about 1016 to 1195, say. You just choose a chunk that makes some kind of sense and try and work on that.
Right. I do really like that story, for people who aren't familiar with it, of William's coronation when the archbishop asks the crowd, will you take this man as your king?
Mhm.
And of course, all of the peasants enthusiastically shout, yes, of course, yes. And then the guards, of course, have been told to be wary of any sort of malicious activity. And when they hear that shouting, as you say, they start to set fire to the local area. Really, such an interesting case study. It's not hard to see why you begin your book talking about that sort of conflict in language.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a story I've been fascinated with for a long time. It's also told by Audric Vitalis slightly differently. Um, but it does really seem to embody some of the themes of the book in terms of English being a strange language and a new, even more multilingual society, and how did people react to that, which is not just a 11th or 12th century problem. How do you react when you hear different languages on the street today? It's
Hmm
the same human problem.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons why I was so interested to read your book is because I've always struggled to define what the difference is between Old and Middle English. I think one of the first things that you identify is that there is a huge cliff's edge of scholarship, probably after the Battle of Malden, around that time with, Wulfstan, Alfrich, and then after that, just no one seems to care, at least from Old English studies, about what happens after that. And then when it comes to Middle English, at least in the popular consciousness, there's just nothing until Chaucer and Gawain and the Green Knight, right? So what kind of difficulties, before we get any further, what kind of difficulties do we face when we try to delineate between Old English and Middle English as languages?
Well, I think in the first instance, we need to acknowledge that Old and Middle English are arbitrary labels. And that's one reason I tend to almost always put scare quotes around old and middle when I use these terms to indicate that they are constructs. And I think in general terms, when most people call a text Old English or call it Middle English, it's on the basis of habit and the way that that text has been referred to over the last 150 years, rather than on any kind of definable linguistic criteria. And there are some texts which are particularly interesting because they seem very concretely to problematize those kind of classifications. So the Peterborough Chronicle is one, because that is a single manuscript which is felt to contain both some very late Old English and some of the very earliest Middle English, and indeed the beginning of Middle English is sometimes dated on the basis of when the first continuation starts in that manuscript, which is 1121. So they say everything to that point is Old English, and then the next year it's Middle English. And that's always quite remarkable because languages essentially are continua. There's not really dramatic change in them. Another example is a homiliary that I've been very interested in, done a lot of work with, which is Cotton Vespasian D14, a collection of 45 or 50 religious pieces, some of which are Old English in origin, so they're based on Elfrich. And then there's a couple of texts which are translated from Latin sources, which we know were composed after the conquest. And people have called these the earliest Middle English purely on the basis of them being translated from demonstrably post-conquest texts. But linguistically, that manuscript is actually very homogeneous. There's really no linguistic difference between these English texts. It's chronology of source that's informing the classification. So it's complicated, is the first thing, and these are arbitrary labels. And to an extent, I don't know if it actually matters to distinguish between Old and Middle English. One of the very earliest articles I wrote, I gave to Eric Stanley for some feedback to see what he thought of it. And I had a footnote that said something like, it's a very interesting question whether these annotations are Old English or Middle English. And these were the annotations in Royal 7C12, which are from about 1170. And his feedback was, no, it's not an interesting question. It's just, it doesn't matter, essentially. And to some extent, that's a solution I've adopted, which I found quite liberating. So if I tend to regard other people as writing about Old and Middle English, and I write about English. I just abandon any attempt to say this is an Old English text, this is a Middle English text, it's an English text. That said, I actually am of the opinion that something is at stake when we call something Old and Middle English. And I hint at this in the book. I don't think I fully work it out, and I think it will take a long time to fully work this out. But one way to see this is essentially that these labels are a kind of shorthand for different practices of writing English. So the Old English is the way that English was written and taught to be written before the Norman Conquest, and Middle English is a new emergent way where either because it was impossible to go on doing what had been done in the pre-conquest period, or because people wanted to change, they started writing English in a new way. And so then classifying things as Old and Middle English is not so much a linguistic question as a kind of cultural historical one about the practice of writing and people's orientation towards different writing systems. But it also matters in a very practical sense. I think this distinction affects the way we work on the period in a very practical sense, because there are books on Old English and there are books on Middle English. There are dictionaries of Old English and dictionaries of Middle English. And the 12th century is in a very liminal position between these. So you really need to be using both the dictionaries of Old English and the grammars of Old English and the dictionaries of Middle English and the grammars of Middle English. And that's not always easy. And so one of the things that this has inspired me to start doing is thinking about, well, how do you connect the grammars of Old and the grammars of Middle, the dictionaries of Old and the dictionaries of Middle, so that actually people can work across these challenging boundaries that periodization has set up.
Yeah, what do you think about that spelling distinction? Because I've heard some people say that the distinction between Old English and Middle English should be the sort of moment where scribes cease to use the sort of Wessex standard that late West Saxon uses, and there are even frustrations that come about from that, in that a lot of people will read those texts and not realize that even by the end of the 10th century, people are writing in ways that they don't anymore speak. I think the most famous example is the dative plural ending, and then the subjunctive en ending. Probably both sounded the same at that time, with this sort of like an sound. And so they get confused a lot, written as on a lot of the time. And then that standard is attempted to be held then pretty far into the 11th century. And then when people stop using it, it's like the language changes overnight. And I hear some frustration in that the language didn't actually change; they just abandoned the writing standard. Do you think that that's kind of like a good boundary for Old English and Middle English, or do you think that it's kind of too complicated? Because surely it's not so black and white, right?
Hmm. Well, so I mean, in a way, that's a version of a very classic definition of the distinction between Old English, Middle English, and Modern English, which is that Old English is the period of full inflection, Middle English is the period of reduced inflection, and Modern English is the period of no inflection. So that is one very traditional way to distinguish different periods in the history of English. I think the challenge I have with it is that we really don't have good data on how frequently dative plural appears in different spellings at different times. And again, this is something that I have more come on to realize as a problem and work on more and more, but actually to really describe the linguistic variation that you see in 10th and 11th and 12th century manuscripts, and to be able to quantify it. And then once you've done that, well, then maybe you can come up with a criteria. But at the moment, I think we just don't have a solid enough grasp on how frequently dative plural appears as how often it appears as en or on or any other spellings. One can certainly spot isolated examples, but how routine they are, I'm really not sure. So people are still using for the dative plural into the 12th century, some scribes composing English for themselves, so not just copying it from another manuscript.
I guess then my question there would be, is that not sort of an adherence to a tradition? Wouldn't we expect to see that from scribes raised to understand that this word is spelled that way, and therefore they spell it that way when they remember to? That's kind of my understanding of that, but it seems that you might be suggesting that's not entirely accurate.
Well, I think it's very tricky fundamentally, because there are really ideally two things we would want evidence for, but we have to make do with one kind of evidence. So we would ideally like to know how people spoke English and how they wrote it, but the only evidence we have is written. The argument that people were spelling in one way because they had been taught to spell in one way kind of depends on knowing also how they pronounce that segment. And yet the only evidence we have for how they pronounce that particular segment comes from the spelling. So it is complicated, I think. And for me, the first step is still better data. And also another thing I increasingly try to do is work primarily with texts which I believe to be original rather than copied. So a charter, for example, where we are reasonably confident this was issued, that we have the issued text in its original single sheet, I'm inclined to trust the language of that much more than an Elfrich manuscript, say, which has gone through an unknown number of copies beforehand. And just to really bring those original things to the surface is an interesting project, because I think that will give us maybe a much clearer sense of language history. And so I'm working on an anthology of 12th century texts for ARC Humanities Press at the moment. And the premise of that is to only use these texts that we can be reasonably confident are extant in more or less originals and are closely datable. And so it's 43 texts in chronological sequence going from about 1042 through to 1215 again, so that you can really see how the language changes in that period. And that's not without its simplifications, because we haven't really talked about region and dialect. But it might give you a sense of how English as a whole, insofar as you can meaningfully talk about English as a whole, changes in that 150-year period.
Yeah, so you mentioned region and dialect. That is something that I would like to real quick ask about because my audience will generally be familiar with the fact that towards the end of the Old English period, almost all of our texts are coming from Wessex, are coming from, Winchester, from that sort of area of southwestern England. When we get past the Norman conquest, does that remain the same? Are our texts still generally coming from that region? Does it become more diverse? What do we begin to see?
I think it does become more diverse. I think we maybe need to first think about whether it's actually true that in the late Old English period, most texts are coming from the southwest. So certainly most of them are believed to be written in a form of West Saxon, which some people would regard as the standard language, and therefore which was written outside of Wessex as well as within it. The number of texts we're like confident where they were actually composed is relatively small. So maybe we need to think about manuscripts instead and copies of those texts. And a very small proportion of the surviving Old English manuscripts, of which there's about 500 that contain some Old English, are securely localized by Kerr. It's only about 15% that he is confident where they're from. So to some extent, we actually don't know where the centers for writing Old English were. Though, as we've said, wherever these texts were being written, they were, it seems, often being written using a potentially standard form of the language based on West Saxon. And that's something I'm also working on at the moment. The picture does shift in the post-conquest period. The southeast has often been held up as a particularly strong center in the 12th century, and a lot of surviving manuscripts have been associated with either Rochester or Canterbury. Again, I tend to be innately a little bit skeptical about how secure some of those attributions are. But certainly, if you think of some of the canonical early Middle English texts, like the Ormulum, that's thought to have been written in Bourne in Lincolnshire, which is not a place we have a great deal of Old English from. There's also more from the Southwest Midlands is often held up as being a real centre for Old English through the activities of the tremulous hand, and then the AB dialect of things like Encren Wissa and the Catherine Group Saints' Lives. There is an apparent geographical shift. Whether that is a real geographical shift, I think, requires more work.
Mhm. While we're on the subject of these sort of original texts, which, by the way, I think the average viewer might be interested to know that these texts we're mentioning now, the AB dialect, this kind of stuff from the South Midlands, is what J.R.R. Tolkien was most interested about in Middle English, and he has a lot of writings about that. But while we're talking about these original texts, you mentioned in your book that there is what you describe as a literary continuum between Old English and Middle English, which I think for the average English student might not be very easy to perceive. Certainly, I don't really think we're taught to understand it that way. Could you describe what you mean by this?
Sure. So I think, in traditional literary histories, um, have generally wanted to see a literary continuum between Old and Middle English literature, whether that's for verse through things like the alliterative revival, the idea of an alliterative revival in the 14th century that somehow picks up on Old English poetic technique 4 centuries later, or in prose through the possibility that people were still reading Elfrich when they were starting to write things like the Catherine group that we just mentioned. And both of those have always struck me as slightly wishful thinking, that um, we really like in literary history to have continuity. And we like to be able to say that everyone has been writing in English since Caedmon first composed his hymn. Um, and so the literary histories, the traditional ones, have tended to hint at continuity, but it's very much a submerged continuity that we can't actually describe any texts. Um, but I nonetheless kind of thought it was an interesting question, the extent to which there might be continuity and a continuum. Uh, and to do that, I really needed to unpack what we meant by literary, I think, which is often used fairly imprecisely, I think, and influenced by what colleagues we work with in English departments who work on more modern periods define as literary. And so the way I ended up operationalizing literariness for the book, and probably still hold to, is that literariness is really a set of practices for writing English. And if we want to talk about a literary continuum, what's at stake is the extent to which one generation inherits that set of practices for writing English from the previous one. And that set of practices is not like in modern literature, particular kinds of metaphor or anything like that. But it's a bit more technical than that. And I ended up at some stage reading some German work by German Romance philologists, Wolf and Österreicher, who talk about Verschriftung and Verschriftlichung. And Verschriftung is scripting. So that's the process by which you take a spoken language and you write it down for the first time. What decisions do you make when you're transcribing a language into writing? And Verschriftlichung, which is generally translated as textualization, is how, once you've started to write a language, how do you start to come up with genres and patterns? And how do you ensure that when you write something down, the person in the next town and city can read it? And so for me, this question of literary continuum was really identifying what the aspects of textualization were for Old English, and then looking at the ways in which they were inherited or not inherited by subsequent generations. And in practice, I thought this was easiest to investigate on the basis of genres. And so I had a chapter devoted to documents, one to chronicles and one to sermons. And so for documents, the question was, well, what documentary forms were developed in the Old English period? And to what extent did those documentary forms continue into the post-conquest period? And if I could show that they continued into the post-conquest period, then I had, to my satisfaction, established that there was some kind of literary continuum. And I suppose, additionally, it wasn't that I was looking for continuity from the 11th century to the present day. I was just interested in continuity from the 11th century to the 12th century. So things might have survived to the 12th century and then died in the 13th. But my narrow interest was across that long 12th century.
Mm. I think what might surprise some viewers when hearing you talk about this is that we're often taught as English students that once the Norman conquest happened, French became the sort of literary language of English. And it wasn't until, this is specifically verbatim what my professor told me, it wasn't really until Chaucer that English speakers were sort of confident enough to write in their own tongue again, which is, I'm often told, is what makes the Canterbury Tales so special. Is this a misconception?
I think it's certainly a simplification. So, for instance, English wasn't the only literary language before the conquest. People were also writing Latin in England. um, French didn't emerge immediately after the Norman conquest. French was barely used in writing in 1066, and it's only by the second half of the 12th century that you can really talk about there being any kind of emergent French literary tradition. And indeed, there are quite provocative arguments that French only starts to get written down because French people see English written down and think we should have a nice written vernacular too. And in my view, that the pivotal moment is not 1066, it's more like 1130. English survives the conquest, but then by 1130, there's other things happening which eventually mean that French takes over as the literary language, and that's really to do with French's cultural prestige by that stage, because you have an Angevin empire that spans England across the Channel into France. So England is bought into a French-speaking empire, which means that really for social progress, you want to be engaged with French rather than English. The University of Paris becomes the major center of learning at that time. And it's probably those factors in the 12th century that mean that English is overtaken by French. But I think, it's a much more exciting narrative to be able to say, well, English died because the French arrived. And that's why that narrative has survived in histories of English. And I think it's one of the reasons I see myself as writing literary history, and I think it's important to write literary history, is that while a lot of work had been done on the 12th century before I wrote, it tended to be quite piecemeal. It was about particular manuscripts and things like that, and challenging existing narratives. But I think the best way to combat an erroneous narrative is to write a new one that's equally compelling. And that was really what I was trying to do, is tell a different story about English that could make its way into textbooks of English. And that's a quite conservative view of literary history today. Like if you read a lot of literary histories, they tend not to like narrative. They want to take a much more episodic approach rather than telling a story. And I wanted to try and tell a story about English in the long 12th century because I felt that the existing stories were somewhat inadequate.
Well, in today's sort of TikTok world, if I were to get onto a sort of online platform and only have about 10 seconds to explain what happened to the English language, if I were to say this other narrative, I could just say, at the Norman conquest, French became the literary language, and then it didn't become English again until Chaucer. How would you give a sort of combating 10-second, maybe not 10 seconds, but sort of what would your version of the story, how would you kind of give it in this sort of package format?
It's a very difficult question. I think,
not to put you on the spot.
Provided I wasn't being peer reviewed on this, I think I would go for something along the lines that of the French were initially very impressed by English. Many of them wanted to learn it, and it inspired them to create French literature. Mm-hmm. That would be my take on it. Because again, in the book, part of one of the things I'm very interested in is looking at how individuals responded to this political and linguistic change. And I was able to document quite a few biographies of French people who learned English, and French people who wrote English, and foreign scribes who wrote English. And that really interested me, that there was that kind of openness to cultural interchange in that period.
I've heard it suggested that the sort of connection between French and Latin might have contributed to its prestige during this period. Although I know that even by Alcuin's time, he famously told them all to stop pronouncing Latin like French because they really ought to be viewed as two different languages already by that point. Do you think there's any truth to that English writers saw French and thought, wow, this is similar to Latin, it's better than our language, or something like that?
So that's a very interesting idea. And I'm genuinely not sure how much metalinguistic awareness there was at that stage of the close connection between French and Latin. One thing it brings to mind is some instances of people quite literate in Latin being quite rude about people who were less literate in Latin because they tried to understand it through French. You get some examples of this in 12th century chroniclers where some poor bishops are chastised because they get the meaning of some Latin wrong, and it's clearly because they're trying to understand it through French, and there are faux amis or false friends there that mislead them. So if we took that evidence, then you might suggest that maybe Latin is clearly the prestige language, and it's kept apart from French by virtue of it being an acquired kind of literacy, and the people who were literate in Latin were very keen to protect that prestige from mere French speakers. But it's a really good question.
Well, I guess we should move on because we have a lot to discuss about the real meat of your book, and we haven't gotten to any of it yet. I think I want to go over the sort of general structure you take with the chapters 4, 5, and 6, which is that you distinguish three genres of English literature in the 12th century. That is historical, like documentary record, history keeping, and then also sermons. So, like religious sermons. Why did you think that it was important to begin with to really distinguish these three genres? Are there things that sort of fall in the cracks, or can we really lump everything into these three categories?
Yeah, and so I think genre is definitely quite a vexed, or genre categorization is quite a vexed task. That genre labels are mostly modern ones, and we're applying them to much older texts. And we don't know what a contemporary classification of genre would have been like. My decision to have chapters focused on genres was not an immediate one. It came through the course of working on the book and trying to work out what the best structure was for it. And it had a kind of practical and a kind of theoretical element to it. The practical one was purely that I thought it was quite difficult to meaningfully compare a sermon with a document. And it would be much easier to compare documents with documents and sermons with sermons, and thereby try and tell a story about how the writing of documents and the writing of sermons changed over time. The more theoretical one was reading, as I often have, some linguistic perspectives on a literary question. So genre is very much a literary term, but linguists also talk about text type. And there was a really enjoyable and quite old book, I think from the 1990s or so, by Tony Becks, where he talks about text type and the different kinds of linguistic registers that are associated with different text types, and also the different formats that are associated with different text types. And this seemed to me very close to the Wolf and Oesterreich idea of textualization that I've already mentioned. And in particular, I was really struck by how he spent about 10 pages looking at a gas bill or a utility bill as a kind of text type. And so he printed one, and he did a close reading of the structure of it on the page. And so that was really, that inspired me to start thinking about text types and seeing if I could organize chapters around them. And then it became documents and chronicles and sermons, simply because these were the genres that I was able to assemble the most material with regard to, and therefore tell the richest narrative. A lot of people, and indeed a couple of the peer reviewers for the book for Cambridge, wanted a full chapter on poetry, but my feeling was, and still is, that it's worth writing about texts that are more neglected, and that poetry gets a lot of coverage in Old English studies in general, and that it's in a way more interesting and a better use of pages to write about something fewer people have thought about.
The gas bill, that is really interesting. Do you remember what his takeaways were?
What struck me was just the bold, and I'm a real sucker for these kind of things, that the boldness of taking this kind of approach to something so mundane, and actually showing that even a gas bill has a kind of structure and a logic, and there are certain things that users or people who get gas bills assume will be in a gas bill, and the information will be organized in a particular way, and really bringing almost imagining himself to be an, not that he sees it in these terms, but for me, it's a bit like him imagining himself to be an alien and seeing a gas bill for the first time, because we're also accultured to what a bill looks like, that we don't even think about why a bill is organized in that way. But he found a way to come at it as if he'd never seen one before, and to think about, well, why is it organized in this particular manner? And that seems to me a really interesting lens to bring to any kind of text.
Yeah, I think that is something that we can really very often forget when reading ancient texts is the different sort of modes that they would write in. And I've often looked at my own sort of, tax bills, random little scratches that I write along here and there, and think like, what would happen if a linguist from 1,000 years in the future got this, and this was their only, sliver of information from like 21st century English. What would happen if all they had was a piece of paper that I had from one of my classes that was about, gender relations in the 19th century, and I had scribbled like part of Cicero's In Catalina on the bottom. Like, what would that make them think of our society, of our culture, if all they had was that? And it really helps me put things in perspective when reading ancient texts in the same way. Like, these people never intended for this to be sort of the example of English for future historical linguistics scholars, for future historical linguists. And really that brings me to I think the first of your genres, the documentary record, which is probably the most in that vein of things that if you had told the writer this is going to be examined as as an example of English for historical linguists, they might have been pretty confused about that. What kind of texts do we see in this category?
We have a very large number of surviving documents from the pre-conquest period, almost 2,000 in total. And these span a variety of genres, of text types. So there are, but not infinite varieties. So there's quite a few well-demarked categories. So there's diplomas, which are documents which record very formally the transfer of land from one party to another and invoke God's blessing on the transaction. These are predominantly written in Latin in the pre-conquest period, but almost invariably have a description of the estate that's actually being transacted in English, a boundary clause that describes how you circumnavigate the estate so that it can be identified subsequently. So those are diplomas. Then there's writs, which are effectively letters from the king to the shire courts. And these survive primarily from Edward the Confessor's reign, but it's thought that the practice began considerably earlier. And indeed, people have argued that Alfred's preface to the Pastoral Care, which is quite a famous text, is in the form of a writ, that the address of that is kind of like a writ. There's writs, then there's notifications, which is a sort of more catch-all category. They tend to be writs are in English, and the notifications are also in English. And they're a bit of a catch-all category for sort of a document that begins something like, we'd like it to be known, or it should be manifest that, and that records some particular arrangement of some kind. Then there's wills, where people, as now, bequeath their property up after their death. These again tend to be in English in the pre-conquest period. So there's those four major categories, and each has their own form, their own conventions, their own linguistic norms, and that's why I was quite interested in looking at what happened to them after the conquest. And the sort of big fact that makes it into all the history of English textbooks is that William the Conqueror's chancery abandoned English in 1070. So in 1066, when they arrived, they continued the practice of Edward the Confessor's chancery in using English, but within 4 years, they've switched to Latin. And that's held up as a kind of watershed moment for the abandonment of English after the conquest. But what interested me, and there's a catalogue of these by David Palteret, is that there's about 100 post-conquest documents that do contain some English. And so I was interested in those as being a kind of anomaly, and wondering, why does English continue to be used in some contexts? And so I ended up focusing on a number of different kinds of document in that chapter. One was a sequence of writs in favor of Christchurch, Canterbury, which started being issued in the reign of Henry I and lasted to Henry II. And they're bilingual, so they have Latin at the top and English at the bottom. They survive in multiple copies. So there's about 20 of these between 1100 and 1160, say. And I was quite interested in tracking those and looking at where they were being copied, what significance this held to the monastery, what kinds of scribes were copying them. And particularly interesting to me was that there are some copies that come directly from the royal court, from scribes who we know crossed the channel with Henry II. They were presumably French or French speaking, and yet they were tasked with copying these English documents. So they seemed to me to open up interesting questions about who was using English in this period.
Hmm.
And then I wrote and investigated a little bit the bilingual form in general. So pre-conquest documents were almost invariable in either English or Latin, whereas in the post-conquest period, you get quite a few bilingual documents where you have the text first in Latin and then in English. And I was quite interested why that particular form was adopted, and found some very interesting examples where very highly formal Latin documents, so the diplomas, were being translated into English. And because the Latin was so formal and rhetorical, this was forcing people to write a very unusual kind of English that didn't really exist in the pre-conquest period. So this decision to adopt a bilingual form was forcing a kind of stylistic innovation in a period that we think of as largely imitative. So while some people are willing to admit continuity into the post-conquest period, they rarely say it was a creative period for the writing of English, but these documents seem to suggest it might be. And then in all of these chapters, I kind of tracked the genre to when I regarded its demise as being, and really the last evidence for documents in English before the late 14th century seemed to me to be the 1150s and 1160s. And then everything switched to Latin until in the late 14th century, English started to be used again.
Do we see the same timeline for historical texts written in English?
Yeah, broadly speaking, I think. So there, the kind of famous one is the Peterborough Chronicle, where the final continuation is completed shortly after 1154. So in the 1150s, that's a very similar kind of chronology. So kind of fervid activity in the early decades of the 12th century, but by 1150, not much. With the history writing, it was very much the Peterborough Chronicle is the one that everyone knows about and tends to appear in the textbooks of the history of English or of English literary history. And so I didn't want to say too much about that because, again, I like to focus on the less known texts. I picked up a couple of other versions of the Chronicle, the F version, which is from Canterbury and is bilingual, so that a scribe who translated the Chronicle into Latin and then presents each annal in Latin and then in English and adds some material of his own. There's a single leaf fragment called H, which has events for 1113 and 1114, and also the Caligula Annals, which are sometimes called the I version of the Chronicle, which have annals from before the conquest through to quite late in the 13th century, but English stops being used in 1109. And here, what I was interested in is the extent to which the people who were continuing the Chronicle into the 12th century were actually conscious of the ways that the Chronicle had been written before the conquest. Were they using the same formulas? Did they have the same attitude towards historical writing? Were they still beginning their annals here in this year? Were they still concerned with people dying in battles and the same kind of issues? And the answer was they were, and even in some cases, demonstrably foreign scribes were kind of writing chronicle style English, which was rather nice. But at the same time, they were innovating and bringing in features that were starting to emerge in Latin historical writing of the 12th century. So there's a lot of direct speech in the F version of the Chronicle, for instance, and almost no direct speech in the pre-conquest Chronicle. The annals get longer. So the pre-conquest chronicle is very factual, very short notices of events, but then after the conquest, you get much fuller, longer annals. They start embedding documents in the history, which had never happened before the conquest, so on. So it wasn't just imitation, but it was also adaptation, and that was an interesting story to tell.
Hmm. And then when it comes to these religious sermons, I was really interested to see at the beginning of your chapter on that, chapter 6, if I believe, is a sort of text of a bishop, instructing that priests and bishops should be teaching the Pater Noster, the sort of these prayers in the native language, which of course we understand to be English. And then you kind of talk a bit about this. Could you sort of elaborate on what I know that there's a lot of tradition of giving sermons in Latin, or at least writing down sermons in Latin, but clearly we have English sermons even in the 10th century and then onwards into the 12th century. Could you talk a bit about these?
I became quite interested in what sermons were actually used for. That there's a tendency to just sort of take it for granted that a sermon was either to be preached or to be read quietly alone. And Elfrich actually says this in the preface to the Catholic homilies, that they're seu audiendo sive legendo, they're either for listening to or reading. But I wanted a bit more concrete information about the ways sermons were used in the 12th century. And so I read a lot of narrative history from the 12th century of Latin sources, and also some treatises on how to preach and things like that. And one of the things that emerged is that actually recording the sermons in English is theoretically quite unusual. That the idea that the treatises give is more that ideally you should be able to come up with a sermon for yourself spontaneously. But if you're not capable of that, then you should use a Latin sermon as your model and translate it on the hoof, as it were. So translate it extempore to your audience. And so in that sense, it actually seemed to me that writing the sermons down in English was a little bit aberrant, and that hadn't fully been realized. And I suggested that one possible explanation for that was that these were intended for people who weren't entirely confident in English. So after the conquest, the ecclesiastical elite had primarily switched from being people of English birth to being people of continental birth. And if you're a new bishop who doesn't know English and you have to give a sermon, maybe actually having an English text of that sermon rather than being expected to translate a Latin one into a language that you don't entirely know could actually be quite helpful. And so I looked at a couple of particularly relevant to this is a group of sermon collections that survive in 4 manuscripts, more or less, 2 of which are reasonably well known if you happen to work on early Middle English, but possibly not beyond that, the Lambeth and Trinity homilies. And then another manuscript, which is now lost, the Otho homilies, contains some sermons in common with Lambeth and Trinity. And then Otho itself is connected to a 4th manuscript now in Worcester, which has 1 English sermon, which was also in the Otho collection. So there's this nexus of 4 manuscripts, some from the West Midlands, some from the East Midlands, that contain these sermons that are very interesting in that they have instructions in Latin on how to preach them, and then they have the English text. It's like intercalcated. So you get some Latin, and you get some English, and you get some Latin, and you get some English. And a lot of the time, the English is just a translation of the Latin or develops on the Latin. But sometimes there are these instructions, that say things like, at this moment, it might be appropriate to do this. And so that the audience for them seemed to me to potentially be this class of people who knew Latin but weren't entirely confident in English. So I was quite interested in those. And I also wrote a case study of the Vespasian homilies, which is a booklet, 4 sermons, probably from Rochester in Kent. two of which have origins in Elfrich and two of which are more 12th century, and looking at the extent to which these sermons, though collected together around 1150, were looking back to the pre-conquest tradition, but also forward to much more modern things like Cistercian spirituality and a much more kind of effective piety, where you get a description of God as being like a mother rubbing a child's head as it goes to sleep.
Hmm.
Not a very old English image, but
That's absolutely fascinating. The point about the perhaps not, maybe not native English speakers, or at least not super confident English speakers being given the English text with Latin instructions. When I read that, I was so struck at that concept of maybe like sort of Norman or French priests being given an English text, like a script to read from to their native flock. That's one of the coolest takeaways, I think, from this whole thing.
yeah. And Bella Millett has a new edition of both Lambeth and Trinity coming out with the Early English Text Society pretty soon, and I think that will be really interesting because they haven't been edited since 1860 or so. So that should really help with making these texts a little bit better.
At the end of your book, you mention this poem, Sanctus Beda was iboren here, right? Yeah. And for those who are unaware, that means Saint Bede was born here. And it's a poem talking about the sort of once great state of learning in England. Could you explain a bit about what this is?
Yeah, so it's difficult to talk about what this poem is without talking about how it survives, which I think is one of the reasons it hasn't been seen quite as clearly as it might be. So it survives from Worcester in a single manuscript, which was copied by the Tremulous Hand, who was a early 13th century monk of Worcester, it would seem, who read and annotated a lot of Old English in extraordinary detail. So he copied this poem in a manuscript, which also he had a copy of Elfrich's Grammar and Glossary and a dialogue between the soul and the body. And this is on the last leaf, this poem. It's badly damaged. The vellum he was given to make this manuscript was very poor to begin with. And the poem suffered some damage after that. So about four letters are missing from each line of it. And as you say, the poem is about how extensive, how learned the English were in the past. It seems to mention Elfrich, it mentions Bede, it mentions various English saints. And the poem has always been read as kind of showing cultural dislocation, essentially, that this is someone writing in the early 13th century and saying, implicitly saying, the Normans have arrived, it used to be great, now it's terrible. And some of the material facts of its transmission have been seen to reinforce that like this person could only get hold of this rubbish vellum to write this poem down on. And it's damaged, which shows that no one cares about it. And I wanted to argue a little bit against that, because it seemed a little out of kilter with what I'd been finding in the rest of the book. And so I tried to show the extent to which the texts that it talks about as being lost weren't in fact lost, but had survived, and the extent to which it seemed to engage in some of the same practices of writing as I had seen in the documents and the chronicles that I had written about elsewhere. And really to suggest that it was a bit more celebratory than demoralizing. And so it was celebrating the past, but not necessarily saying that the present was awful either.
Although there is a pretty ironic line where the poet seems to confuse Alcuin and Alvrich, saying that we used to have Alcuin, also known as Alvrich, totally different people separated by not only the other sides of the country, but a couple centuries in between them. I've always chuckled at that.
There's various little mistakes in there, as it were. That's not the only one, but it's probably the most striking. And I think one of the things I was keen to be quite careful about is not to assume that well, a lot of people have assumed, I think, that the Tremulous Hand actually wrote the poem. He composed it as well as copied it, but that's purely an assumption. So that there might be some remove between the composition of the poem and its copying, and that if there's mistakes, they're not necessarily the mistakes of the poet. They could be mistakes as a consequence of transmission. So um, I don't see that the mistakes as necessarily indicating cultural dislocation any more than like a scribal error in Beowulf indicates huge problems.
Yeah. So then, do you have a sort of final word then for people who are perhaps interested in the transition between Old and Middle English, haven't necessarily been able to get their hands on a lot of information about it? You've mentioned a few upcoming works, not only by others, but by yourself as well. What is your kind of final encouragement for these students?
Well, I think fundamentally it's a very fascinating period to work on, and there's a huge amount to be done um, in terms of looking properly at these texts. Um, and I hope that the anthology I'm working on, which should be out next year, will help in the same way that having anthologies of Old and Middle English have been quite key uh, to students learning Old English for the first time. They're actually to have collected together in one set of covers 42 texts from this period will be novel and eye-opening as well as an introduction. Um, but beyond that, or before that, read what there is. There's people who've done very important work on this period. Elaine Trahan, obviously, living through conquest. Amos van Baalen, who's got a PhD on this topic soon. Read what there is. If you're excited in pursuing it further, definitely contact me, contact the other people who work on the period because there's masses to do. If you want to do a PhD on some 12th century text, that would be great.
Do you have a estimated date for when your anthology is going to release?
I think sometime probably second half of next year would be my current
Wonderful.
guess.
All right, folks. Well, look out for that. Mark Faulkner, thank you very much for coming on the channel.
Very welcome.